In the beginning of a narcissistic relationship, what stands out most is intensity. It does not feel ordinary, gradual, or uncertain. Instead, it feels immediate and powerful, like something meaningful has finally arrived. You may feel deeply seen, deeply understood, and emotionally chosen in a way that feels rare. Conversations can be long, personal, and filled with connection. There is often a sense that this person recognizes your wounds, your dreams, and the parts of you that others overlooked. That recognition can feel comforting, almost relieving, as if you no longer have to explain yourself. Attention is consistent and strong. Messages arrive frequently. Compliments feel specific and personal. You may hear that you are different, special, unlike anyone they have ever met. This creates emotional closeness quickly, but what is important to understand is that speed can feel like intimacy even when true intimacy has not yet been built. The relationship begins to move forward before you have time to evaluate it. Plans may happen early. There can be conversations about the future, shared goals, and long-term ideas that normally develop over time. This forward projection creates security and excitement at the same time. It gives the relationship a sense of certainty before consistency has been demonstrated. You are not just experiencing the present. You are emotionally stepping into a future that feels promised. Another part of this phase is emotional mirroring. You may notice that this person seems to like what you like, value what you value, and agree with your perspectives. This can feel like compatibility, but it also creates rapid bonding. When someone reflects your identity back to you, connection feels effortless. You feel understood without friction, and that absence of friction can feel like proof that the relationship is right. There is also a strong sense of reassurance. If you express insecurity, it is quickly soothed. If you share something vulnerable, the response may feel supportive and validating. This builds trust fast. You begin lowering emotional defenses because the environment feels safe. You are not expecting harm in a space that feels affirming. What often goes unnoticed is how the pace affects perception. When something moves quickly, your nervous system adapts to the intensity. The attention becomes the new normal. The closeness becomes expected. Because of this, slowing down can feel uncomfortable later, even when slowing down would create clarity. The fast start quietly sets a standard that the relationship will struggle to maintain. During this phase, effort appears high. They show up, they initiate, they express interest clearly. That effort communicates value. It signals that you matter. Humans naturally attach where effort is visible because effort feels like care. The problem is not the presence of effort. It is when effort is used to create attachment before emotional reliability is proven over time. You may also feel relief. If you have experienced uncertainty or inconsistency in past relationships, this intensity can feel like the opposite of that pain. It feels decisive, clear, certain. That relief deepens attachment because it feels like you have finally found something stable. The emotional contrast between past disappointment and present intensity makes the connection feel even stronger. Another subtle dynamic is exclusivity. The relationship may quickly feel important, central, and prioritized. You may spend more time communicating, thinking about them more often, and reorganizing your emotional energy around the connection. This does not feel forced. It feels natural because the attention is rewarding. Attachment grows in environments where reward is frequent. What makes this phase powerful is that nothing feels wrong. There are few obvious reasons to question what is happening. In fact, questioning it may feel unnecessary or even pessimistic. When something feels good, the mind looks for confirmation, not caution. You interpret intensity as compatibility, reassurance as safety, and speed as clarity, but the beginning is not just about how they show up, it is about what this creates inside you. Hope expands, expectations form, emotional investment deepens. You begin building meaning around the relationship, often before patterns have had time to fully reveal themselves. This phase matters because it shapes everything that follows. The emotional memory of the beginning becomes a reference point you return to later. When confusion appears, you remember the intensity. When inconsistency appears, you remember how certain it once felt. The beginning becomes proof that the connection was real, even when the experience later becomes unstable. The idealization phase is powerful not because it is fake in every moment, but because it creates attachment faster than understanding. It builds emotional commitment before emotional predictability, and when attachment forms quickly, stepping back later becomes much harder. What feels like the start of love is often the start of bonding. And bonding, when created through intensity rather than consistency, can anchor you to a relationship long before you have enough information to truly evaluate it. Emotional acceleration is the moment when the relationship begins to move faster than your ability to process it. It is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it feels exciting, flattering, and deeply connecting. The pace creates a sense that something meaningful is unfolding quickly, and because it feels good, the speed rarely gets questioned. You may notice that communication becomes frequent very early, messages arrive throughout the day, conversations stretch late into the night. There is little space between interactions, and that constant presence creates emotional closeness. Familiarity forms faster than it normally would. It can feel like you have known this person much longer than you actually have. With emotional acceleration, depth appears quickly. Personal stories, vulnerabilities, and meaningful topics surface early in the connection. You may share things you usually take time to reveal. This exchange of vulnerability can feel like trust, but vulnerability shared quickly does not always mean trust has been built. It means openness is happening faster than emotional safety can be evaluated. Another part of this acceleration is certainty. The relationship may be framed as special very early. You might hear language that suggests uniqueness, destiny, or rare compatibility. Statements about the future can appear before the present has stabilized. This creates emotional momentum. Instead of discovering the relationship step by step, you feel pulled forward by a narrative that already sounds defined. Decisions can begin to happen faster too. Spending more time together, prioritizing the relationship, or emotionally committing can occur before you have seen how this person handles stress, conflict, disappointment, or boundaries. The pace moves you toward investment before observation has had time to happen. What makes emotional acceleration powerful is how it affects your nervous system. Frequent attention creates reward. The brain begins to associate this person with comfort, excitement, and validation. That reward pattern strengthens attachment. You may find yourself thinking about them more often, checking your phone more frequently, and feeling a noticeable emotional shift based on their presence or absence. Because the connection feels strong, slowing down can feel unnatural. If communication decreases even slightly, you may feel confusion or anxiety. Not because anything is wrong yet, but because the original pace created a baseline expectation. When intensity becomes normal, neutrality can feel like distance. Emotional acceleration can also blur boundaries gently. You may become more available than you plan to be. You may rearrange routines, respond quickly, or prioritize the relationship without consciously deciding to. It feels voluntary because the experience is rewarding, but over time, your emotional space becomes increasingly shaped around the connection. Another subtle effect is perception. Speed can create the illusion of clarity. When something moves fast, it feels decisive. It feels intentional. You may interpret that momentum as emotional maturity or seriousness, but speed is not the same as stability. Momentum is not the same as consistency. There is often a sense of emotional immersion. The relationship occupies mental space quickly. You replay conversations, anticipate future interactions, and begin forming meaning around small moments. This is not weakness. It is how attachment works under conditions of frequent emotional stimulation. The more stimulation, the faster bonding occurs. During this phase, effort may still appear strong and mutual. That mutual intensity reinforces the belief that the pace is healthy. It feels reciprocal, which reduces doubt. You may believe you are both simply excited, both equally invested, both moving naturally towards something meaningful. And sometimes that belief prevents you from noticing whether the pace allows room for reflection. Emotional acceleration also limits contrast. When interactions are constant, there is little time to observe absence. Space is where patterns become visible. Space is where you notice consistency, reliability, and emotional regulation. Without space, the relationship is experienced as a continuous flow rather than a series of observable behaviors. You may also feel a quiet pressure to match the pace. Not because anyone explicitly demands it, but because slowing down can feel like risking the connection. When something feels special, people naturally protect it. Matching intensity can feel like care, commitment, or appreciation. Over time, the acceleration shapes expectations before evidence exists. You expect closeness because closeness was immediate. You expect reassurance because reassurance was frequent. You expect presence because presence was constant. These expectations form quickly, and later changes in pace can feel more destabilizing because the baseline was set so high. What matters most about this phase is not that fast connection is always unhealthy, but that speed reduces information. The faster you move, the less time you have to see patterns across different situations. Emotional acceleration prioritizes feeling over observation. It prioritizes momentum over understanding. The relationship begins to feel significant before it has been fully experienced. And when significance forms early, attachment becomes strong early. That attachment can make later confusion harder to interpret, because your emotional investment was built during a time when everything felt clear, mutual, and certain. Acceleration creates bonding before stability has proven itself. And once bonding exists, the relationship is no longer just something you are exploring. It becomes something you are trying to preserve. The first subtle red flags rarely appear as obvious problems. They are small, easily dismissed moments that do not match the intensity of the beginning, yet do not feel serious enough to confront. Because the relationship started with connection and certainty, these moments are often explained away rather than examined. A comment may be framed as humor, but leaves a quiet discomfort behind. Something about it feels slightly critical, slightly diminishing, yet it is delivered in a way that makes reaction feel unnecessary. You may tell yourself it was a joke, that you are being sensitive, or that everyone sometimes says the wrong thing. The discomfort passes, but the moment is stored internally. Another red flag can appear as inconsistency in empathy. There may be times when your feelings are deeply validated, and other times when they are minimized or redirected. The shift is subtle enough that it does not immediately register as a pattern. Instead, it creates confusion. You remember the supportive version of them, so the dismissive moment feels like an exception. You might also notice conversations slowly turning back toward them. You share something meaningful, but the focus drifts. It is not abrupt. It happens gradually in ways that seem natural. Over time, you may feel slightly less heard, but because attention still exists overall, the change feels difficult to define. There can be small boundary tests, requests that feel minor, expectations that appear reasonable on the surface. You may adjust without thinking much about it. Flexibility is normal in relationships, so these adjustments do not immediately stand out. But each small adjustment teaches the relationship how much you are willing to accommodate. Subtle criticism often hides inside comparison. It may sound like advice, observation, or concern. The message is not direct rejection, it is gentle correction. You may feel encouraged to change something small about yourself, your behavior, or your choices. Because the relationship still feels positive, this influence can feel supportive rather than controlling. Another early signal is defensiveness when you express discomfort, not intense conflict, but a shift where your concern becomes the focus instead of the original issue. You may find yourself explaining your tone, your intention, or your reaction. The conversation moves away from what happened and toward why you responded. This creates a quiet pattern where raising concerns feels slightly harder each time. There can also be moments of unpredictability that are easy to overlook. A delayed response that feels different from before. A mood shift that is not explained. A reaction that feels disproportionate but passes quickly. Because these moments are brief, they blend into the overall positive experience. Your mind prioritizes the larger narrative of connection. One of the most important aspects of subtle red flags is internal dialogue. You begin interpreting rather than observing. Instead of simply noticing discomfort, you start explaining it. You search for context that keeps the relationship coherent with the positive beginning. This interpretation protects attachment, but it can also delay clarity. You may notice yourself hesitating before bringing something up. The hesitation is small, almost invisible, but it matters. It suggests that the emotional environment is no longer entirely effortless. Something in you is beginning to measure reactions, anticipate responses, or weigh whether a concern is worth it. Subtle red flags also create contrast with the idealized start. Because the beginning felt so strong, these moments feel out of place. Rather than seeing them as information, you may see them as anomalies. The memory of the early intensity becomes evidence that the relationship is good, which makes contradictory moments easier to dismiss. There is often a growing sense of ambiguity, nothing clearly wrong, yet something not entirely right. This ambiguity is difficult because humans seek clear categories. If something is obviously harmful, action feels justified. But when discomfort is intermittent and mild, uncertainty keeps you engaged. Another dynamic is self-correction. You may begin adjusting your behavior slightly to avoid those uncomfortable moments. You choose words more carefully. You soften concerns, you overlook things faster. These adjustments feel small, but they represent the beginning of emotional adaptation. Importantly, subtle red flags rarely create urgency. They create questions. Questions without clear answers tend to remain open, and open questions allow the relationship to continue without confrontation. You stay in observation mode while attachment continues to deepen. The early stage of red flags is not defined by dramatic events. It is defined by repetition of small moments that shift emotional safety in quiet ways. Each moment alone seems insignificant. Together, they begin shaping the relational atmosphere. What makes these signs powerful is that they appear while the relationship is still rewarding. Positive experiences continue, which makes negative signals feel less reliable. Your brain weighs the overall connection against isolated discomfort and often chooses the larger story. This is where confusion begins its earliest formation. Not because something extreme has happened, but because two realities start to exist at the same time. The relationship that feels good and the moments that do not fully align with that feeling. Subtle red flags are information delivered softly. They do not demand attention, they invite interpretation. And when interpretation replaces observation, clarity naturally takes longer to arrive. Confusion is the emotional turning point where the relationship no longer feels consistently clear, yet it also does not feel clearly unhealthy. It exists in the space between certainty and doubt. What makes this stage difficult is that you are not reacting to one obvious event. You are responding to mixed signals that are hard to organize into a single explanation. You may begin noticing that your emotional experience changes more frequently. One moment you feel close and secure, and another moment you feel unsure without understanding why. Nothing dramatic has necessarily happened, but the predictability that existed at the beginning is no longer stable. This unpredictability creates mental noise. You start thinking more about the relationship instead of simply experiencing it. During this stage, questions appear quietly. You may wonder if you misunderstood something, if you overreacted, or if you are expecting too much. These questions are not always spoken out loud. They often stay internal. Instead of evaluating the relationship directly, you evaluate your perception of it. The focus shifts from what is happening to am I interpreting this correctly, and mixed messages play a central role. Words and actions do not always align. Someone may express care but behave in ways that feel distant. They may reassure you after a moment of discomfort, which temporarily resolves tension but does not remove the pattern. The reassurance becomes relief, and relief can interrupt deeper reflection. Confusion also grows when positive experiences continue alongside discomfort. If everything were negative, clarity would come faster, but moments of warmth, attention, or connection still appear. These moments act as emotional anchors. They remind you of the beginning and create hope that the relationship is still stable. Hope makes inconsistency easier to tolerate. Another aspect of this stage is cognitive effort. You begin analyzing interactions more closely. Conversations are replayed, tone is examined, you search for meaning in small details. This analysis is not a sign of weakness, it is the mind trying to restore predictability. Humans naturally look for patterns when something stops making sense. You may also notice a shift in emotional responsibility. Instead of assuming the relationship will naturally feel balanced, you start thinking about how your behavior might influence outcomes. You consider timing, wording, and reactions more carefully. This creates a subtle sense that stability depends on you being careful rather than the relationship being inherently stable. Communication can feel slightly more complicated. Bringing up concerns may lead to resolution sometimes, but other times it leads to defensiveness, minimization, or redirection. Because responses vary, you cannot predict the outcome of expressing yourself. This unpredictability reinforces hesitation and deepens confusion. At this point, memory begins to compete with present experience. You remember how clear things felt before, and that memory shapes interpretation. When something feels off, you compare it to the earlier version of the relationship rather than evaluating it independently. The past becomes evidence that the present confusion must have an explanation that preserves the relationship. There is often an increase in self-monitoring. You pay attention to your tone, your emotional reactions, and whether you are being fair. Self-awareness is healthy, but in confusion it can become hyper-awareness. You may feel responsible for keeping the emotional atmosphere smooth even when you cannot control it. Confusion also delays boundaries. Boundaries require clarity about what feels acceptable and what does not. When you are unsure whether something is a pattern or an isolated moment, setting a boundary can feel premature. You wait for more information, but while you wait, the pattern continues forming. Another important element is emotional contrast. The difference between good moments and uncomfortable moments becomes more noticeable. The relationship starts to feel like fluctuation rather than stability. Because humans are drawn to relief, the return of warmth after discomfort can feel especially powerful. Relief can strengthen attachment even when inconsistency caused the discomfort. You may notice that conversations about the relationship become circular. Issues seem addressed but not fully resolved. The same themes reappear in slightly different forms. This repetition contributes to the sense that something is unresolved, even when there is no clear conflict happening in the moment. Confusion affects trust, not only trust in the other person, but trust in yourself. When experiences are inconsistent, your interpretation of events feels less reliable. You may hesitate to rely on your feelings as valid information. Instead of using discomfort as guidance, you treat it as a question mark. This stage is emotionally draining because it requires constant interpretation. You are holding multiple possibilities at once: that the relationship is healthy, that you are overthinking, that something is changing, that things will return to how they were. Holding these possibilities simultaneously prevents decisive clarity. Importantly, confusion does not mean you already understand what is happening. It means you sense that understanding is incomplete. It is the mind recognizing discrepancy without yet having language for it. That recognition often appears as mental looping, emotional uncertainty, and a growing desire for reassurance. Confusion is not failure, it is a natural response to inconsistency. When signals conflict, clarity takes time. But confusion also marks the moment where awareness begins to form, even if it is not fully conscious yet. The relationship is no longer experienced only through feeling, it is experienced through questioning. And questioning is the first quiet movement towards seeing patterns that once felt invisible. Inconsistency becomes the emotional climate when unpredictability is no longer occasional but expected. The relationship starts to feel defined by fluctuation, closeness followed by distance, warmth followed by criticism, attention followed by absence. What makes this stage powerful is not any single moment, but the pattern of contrast repeating over time. You may notice that the connection still exists, but it no longer feels stable. Some interactions feel deeply reassuring, almost like the beginning has returned. In those moments, doubt fades. You feel relief, connection, and hope. But those experiences are interrupted by periods that feel confusing or emotionally cold. The shift can happen without clear explanation, leaving you trying to understand what changed. Because positive moments continue, the relationship never feels entirely broken. Instead, it feels unpredictable. You begin anticipating change even when things feel good. Enjoyment becomes mixed with quiet vigilance. Part of you relaxes into connection while another part watches for the shift. Inconsistency creates emotional contrast that strengthens attachment. When warmth returns after distance, it feels meaningful. Relief can feel like proof that the relationship is improving or that the difficult moment was temporary. This relief is powerful because humans are wired to move toward reward after discomfort. The return of closeness feels like resolution, even when the underlying pattern remains unchanged. You may start tracking behavior internally, not intentionally but naturally. You notice response times, tone changes, and mood differences. Your attention becomes more focused on signals that indicate whether the relationship is in a good phase or a distant phase. This tracking is an attempt to predict stability, but it also increases emotional preoccupation. During this stage, effort often becomes uneven. You may find yourself trying to restore closeness when distance appears. You initiate conversations, offer reassurance, or adjust your behavior in subtle ways. These actions are not manipulative, they are adaptive. You are responding to unpredictability by trying to create stability. Another effect of inconsistency is shifting standards. Behaviors that once would have felt concerning may begin to feel normal simply because they repeat. The baseline of the relationship adjusts over time. You measure the relationship not against healthy consistency, but against its own fluctuations. If things are better than the last difficult moment, that can feel like progress. Inconsistency also affects emotional expression. You may become more cautious about bringing up concerns because the response is unpredictable. Sometimes concerns are met with understanding, other times with defensiveness or withdrawal. This variability teaches hesitation. You begin choosing timing carefully or deciding that some things are easier not to address. There is often a growing sense of responsibility for maintaining the positive phase. When things feel good, you may feel motivated to preserve it. You become more attentive to tone, more flexible, and more willing to let small discomforts pass. This is not weakness, it is a natural response to wanting stability. But it can slowly shift the balance of emotional labor. Inconsistent reinforcement is one of the strongest drivers of attachment. When positive experiences are unpredictable, they become more psychologically impactful. The mind focuses on regaining those moments of closeness. Hope becomes a central force. You remember the good moments vividly, and those memories influence how you interpret difficult ones. You may also experience internal contradiction. Part of you recognizes the pattern, while another part focuses on exceptions. You tell yourself that everyone has off days, that stress explains the distance, or that the relationship is simply going through phases. These explanations reduce immediate discomfort, but they can delay recognition of repetition. Inconsistency changes how you evaluate time. Instead of asking whether the relationship feels stable overall, you evaluate it moment by moment. A good day can outweigh several difficult ones. The emotional present becomes more influential than the emotional pattern, which keeps you engaged even when stability is limited. Another subtle shift is emotional dependency on reassurance. Because connection is not constant, reassurance becomes more valuable. When reassurance appears, it feels calming, but the need for reassurance grows as predictability decreases. Over time, reassurance replaces consistency as the main source of emotional safety. You may begin questioning your expectations. Rather than asking whether consistency is reasonable, you ask whether you are expecting too much. This reframing moves attention away from the pattern and towards self-evaluation. Self-questioning can make inconsistency feel like something to tolerate rather than something to examine. Inconsistent relationships often feel intense because fluctuation amplifies emotion. High moments feel very high. Low moments feel confusing rather than clearly negative. This emotional variability can create the sense that the relationship is meaningful, complex, or worth working through, even when stability remains limited. What defines this stage is anticipation. You are no longer surprised by change, you are waiting for it. Even during connection, there may be a quiet awareness that distance could return. This awareness creates tension that exists alongside closeness. Over time, inconsistency reshapes focus. Instead of experiencing the relationship as a source of steady connection, you experience it as something that requires navigation. You think about timing, reactions, and patterns more often. Emotional energy shifts from simply being in the relationship to managing the relationship. This cycle of warmth and distance becomes familiar. Familiarity can feel like normalcy, even when it is stressful. Humans adapt quickly to patterns, especially when those patterns include reward. Adaptation makes inconsistency easier to remain inside, even when it creates exhaustion. Inconsistency does not always look dramatic. Often it looks like unpredictability that slowly becomes expected. And when unpredictability becomes expected, the relationship stops feeling secure and starts feeling conditional, not because connection disappears, but because connection no longer feels reliable.